This week on the APUSHow, we're looking at Chapter 30, The Crisis of Authority. We'll look at the youth culture of the 1960s and 70s who are quite rebellious, and I can empathize with that because I have quite the rebellious youth right here. We'll look at the mobilization of minorities, and no, that has nothing to do with a bunch of minorities getting mobile phones. It has a lot to do with minorities mobilizing for rights. We'll look at the new feminism. I hope it's better than the old feminism, because old feminism can get kind of stale and new feminism seems a lot more fresh. We'll look at environmentalism in a turbulent society. I hope that works because I would hate to see a turbulent society that didn't pay attention to environmentalism. Oops. We'll also look at Nixon and Kissinger in the world. I hope there wasn't a whole lot of kissing between Nixon and Kissinger in the world, but if there was, that's fine because we don't judge here on the APUSH Show. Right, Taft? We'll also look at politics and economics under Nixon. I wonder if there's any politics and economics under Nixon. Apparently there was, and it got him into a little bit of hot water. And lastly, we'll look at the Watergate crisis. And it wasn't all water under the bridge at Watergate, as Nixon's nefarious political dealings would ultimately disgrace him forever. All this and more this week on the APUSH Show. The first thing we look at in this 30th chapter is kind of the same thing adults in their 30s think about, and that is youth. And in particular, we're going to look at the youth of the 1960s and 70s as they were profoundly focused on two things, one being liberation and the other being empowerment. To the youth, empowerment meant power to the people, which meant breaking the power grip held by elites, ending the war in Vietnam, achieving racial justice, and achieving a world which was more politically and economically equitable. Liberation had to do with the liberation of marginalized groups like African Americans, Native Americans, women, Latinos, and the LGBTQ plus community, who all sought to achieve respect within their own communities and throughout the nation. And considering we're still seeing a lot of these same demands regarding liberation and empowerment within these communities still being echoed to this day, you can safely assume that these movements had a long way to go and would be a decades-long work in progress. Nice butt, by the way, Taft. Can we turn around, buddy? From a demographic standpoint, the birth of the so-called New Left of the 1960s was not terribly surprising. A whole massive generation was born and raised in a country where they were constantly told that their nation was the safest, wealthiest, and best nation in the world. However, when this generation really started to come of age in the 1960s and realized that issues of civil rights, racial and economic injustice, as well as the Vietnam War all painted a very different picture. Therefore, one shouldn't be shocked when the New Left would emerge out of the radicalization of many of America's youth at college campuses when many of these realizations of the discord in American society were made. The New Left would be made predominantly of young, middle to upper class white Americans who would take aim at the Vietnam War and also take on the causes of liberation and empowerment for African Americans, Latinos, women, and other marginalized groups. Many would read the writings of C. Wright Mills, dabble in Marxist theories, revere certain third world revolutionaries like Che Guevara or Ho Chi Minh, and engage in other counterculture dalliances. But by the early 1960s, the New Left would take more concrete steps toward achieving some of their aims. The Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, would be one of the first major organizations of this New Left when it was formed in Michigan in 1962. Made up of many college students from predominantly prestigious universities, they would draft a document expressing their outrage with the status quo and desire for more massive societal change in the Port Huron Statement. No, Taft, I'm more referring to the somewhat compromised second draft. Despite the SDS's failed efforts at extending their reach into the urban poor areas of America, the New Left would stay predominantly centered on America's college campuses. One such campus that became a hotbed for New Left activity and confrontation would be the University of California at Berkeley. In 1964, an issue regarding free speech at UC Berkeley would spark a nationwide movement demanding free speech. The issue started when students were barred by campus police and administration from engaging in political activities on campus. Students would fight back, confront the police, and engage in a full-on student-wide strike in which nearly 3/4 of Berkeley's students participated. The strike was first meant to fight for students' rights to pass out political literature and recruit political volunteers. 5 years later, Berkeley would again gain national attention with the issue over the People's Park in 1969. The People's Park was a vacant lot that a few students had tried to turn into a park, but the university objected to this as they had planned to turn the lot into a parking garage. The conflict between the students and administration gained a great deal of momentum as it would become emblematic of the youth's struggle against what they considered the forces of oppression. Fiery speeches were given by radical forces within the New Left movement, and after a referendum was passed by the student body with a massive 85% voting in favor of the park, it was clear that the voices of the New Left were a force to be reckoned with. Though the New Left was mostly peaceful, it would occasionally engage in violent rhetoric when given speeches, and on a few instances, some more fringe members of this movement, like the Weathermen, would even engage in violent acts like bombings and arson. But for the most part, the New Left was peaceful as they strove to end the war in Vietnam by either protesting or actively resisting the draft, as well as advocating for social justice. But closely associated with, and in many ways overlapping the New Left counterculture movement, were the hippies. You don't even know what a hippie is. Hippies were members of a type of counterculture that openly flaunted certain social mores as they would dress provocatively, if at all, grow their beards and facial hair long, experiment with drugs like marijuana and other psychedelics like LSD, and engage in a very liberated view of sexual behavior. However, the change in sexual behavior was due in large part to advances in birth control methods, in particular, the advent of the birth control pill, which became widely available around this time. In short, the hippie movement was a reaction against the tight-laced nature of mainstream 1950s culture, which expected people to maintain a normative society that emphasized conformity to a system based on white supremacist, patriarchal norms with an imperialistic outlook on the world. In many ways, the hippie movement would find its center in San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. This neighborhood and others like it throughout the country would become hotbeds for hippie activity where predominantly young people would gather to forge a new society where peace and nature were valued highly, where people were more free to dress how they wanted, love who they wanted, and enter whatever altered or unaltered state of mind they wanted. I knew you were kind of a wild hippie at heart. But you can't have hippies without that key third ingredient to the hippie recipe, rock and roll. Rock and roll gained massive popularity in the 1950s thanks to the popularity of white artists who appropriated the music from black artists. As artists like Elvis Presley were able to introduce the sped-up style of blues known as rock and roll to gigantic American audiences, other artists would pick up the rock and roll mantle for this growing audience. But much like their audiences, rock and roll musicians would transform from somewhat innocent expressions of teenage love and angst into full-fledged revolutionary experimenters who openly challenge social norms in nearly all facets of life. And as we see the American counterculture movement continue to gain steam with the hippie movement and the New Left, we would see that the continued mobilization of oppressed minority groups would continue their struggle for respect and civil rights in this country. We would see the African American civil rights movement continue to chug along in the 1960s, but we would also see that same movement inspire other movements, whether it was women, Latinos, Native Americans, or the LGBTQ+ community. Numerous other minority groups also sought to achieve respect and recognition within American society. Few American minority groups had more legitimate grievances against the American government than Native Americans. As we've seen in earlier chapters, Native Americans would forcibly have their land stolen from them by white Americans and would face intermittent periods of attempted genocide. By the 1960s, Native Americans were the least prosperous, the least wealthy, and the least stable group of people in the nation. When one looks at rates of income, joblessness, life expectancy, and suicide rates, no other group matches the Native Americans in terms of these indicators of a low quality of life. Along with these high markings on the misery index, Native Americans would also see two laws passed in 1953 that would establish what would become known as termination. This meant that the federal recognition of Native American reservations would end, and those reservations would essentially become under the influence of local governments. The problem with that is that termination would result in massive degrees of forced relocation, assimilation, and corruption, which overall resulted in bitter opposition from Native groups. Though some would assimilate into white culture, others would fight this policy and the attitudes behind it, as a new era of Native American militancy would begin in the early 1960s. Outrage at the termination laws, inspiration from the African American Civil Rights Movement, along with a massive population increase, the Indian Civil Rights Movement would take shape in the 1960s. In 1961, more than 400 members of 67 tribes would meet in Chicago and would draft a manifesto that called for, among other things, the right to choose their own way of life. 7 years later, natives managed to spread awareness regarding their rights, which resulted in a few isolated gains in American society. Some schools would abandon using Indian mascots, and fewer films would feature Native Americans as nothing more than nameless enemies of white protagonists. However, the American Indian movement would establish itself in 1968 as young, militant Native activists would push for more practical and immediate action. Their efforts would not be in vain, as Congress would pass the Indian Civil Rights Act, which recognized tribal law within reservations. Activists would also occupy key areas they claimed were rightfully theirs, as was the case at Puget Sound, Alcatraz Island, and famously at Wounded Knee, South Dakota, where in 1973 activists would seize the town, demanding recognition for an ignored treaty issued in the 1890s. But more immediate progress would be achieved in key legal victories. In 1978, the Supreme Court ruled in United States v. Wheeler that tribes could have independent legal standing and thus could not be terminated. In County of Oneida versus Oneida Indian Nation, the court ruled in favor of natives when it supported native claims to over 100,000 acres of land in upstate New York to the Oneida tribe. However, despite the activism and assorted legal victories, many felt the Indian Civil Rights Movement fell well short in gaining social, political, and economic justice for Native Americans. Yet, thanks to the efforts of activists in the social and legal sense, progress was certainly made in terms of Native rights. And in keeping tune with other movements aimed at establishing rights and respect for other marginalized groups, Latino activism would also mobilize during this period. Much like Native Americans and African Americans, Latinos are by no means a single, unified, and monolithic group, as there were descendants of Spanish settlers whose families had lived in the United States for generations, Puerto Ricans who migrated in large numbers to many eastern cities, especially New York, Cubans who left the Castro regime in greater and greater numbers and settled predominantly in the eastern part of the U.S., Central Americans who would migrate in the 1980s to escape war, poverty, and turmoil in their own nations, and of course, the largest Latino group of all, Mexicans, who had been migrating to the United States in huge numbers since World War II. But we shall see that the ever-changing, somewhat hypocritical yet always ineffective American efforts to control Latino migration would in many ways reflect and also differ from earlier American efforts to control waves of migration from Europe and Asia in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Mexican migration has always been incredibly complex for the United States, as the American relationship with the nation of Mexico has never been smooth. Whether it was the United States steadily encroaching upon Mexican territory in the early 19th century, full-on conquering Mexico by the mid-19th century, and engaging in a business and market-centered imperialist relationship with Mexico from the mid-19th century onward, the United States has been one of the most disruptive forces for the nation of Mexico. Therefore, Therefore, it should come as no surprise that America's destabilizing presence has helped cause widespread poverty throughout the country, and with America's relative prosperity looming just north, it should also come as no surprise that so many Mexicans wish to pursue a better life just north of the border. Adding to the confusion is the fact that the United States has encouraged and then later discouraged Mexican labor at various points in American history. During the Great Depression, the American government would racistly deport many Mexicans to make room for employment opportunities for white Americans. Just a few years later, during World War II, the American government would ask for that same Mexican labor to return in the Bracero program in order to fulfill needed jobs in manufacturing and agriculture during the war. However, when the war ended and American prosperity continued, it's not like Mexicans simply stopped coming after the government ended the program. In fact, Latinos would come in greater and greater numbers as a steady stream of migration would continue mostly to American cities from the 1950s to the present. Latinos would take on a variety of roles within American life, ranging from low-paying service jobs all the way up to careers as executives and political leaders. Between 1960 and 1970, the Latino population expanded from 3 million to 9 million. By 2009, that number had exploded to 48 million. As their numbers would increase, so would the Latino political presence, albeit somewhat slowly. Like many immigrant groups that arrived earlier in the United States, Latinos faced challenges in terms of becoming involved in American politics as language barriers, cultural barriers, and a heavy dollop of white supremacist discrimination all would hinder Latinos from joining unions, becoming franchised, and organizing social and political movements. Yet these challenges were not insurmountable, as a sizable activist movement would emerge in the 1960s in the Chicano movement. Young Mexican-American activists in the 1960s would call themselves Chicanos as a way of taking power away from a derisive white term and to create a shared identity of Spanish-speaking Americans. Some Chicanos would advocate for full-blown nationalist movements like La Raza Unida, which was a political party in the Southwest that pushed for a Mexican-American autonomous state within a state in the 1970s. But perhaps the most well-known figure from this period would be the union activist Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez was an Arizona-born Latino farm worker who effectively organized the largely Mexican-American United Farm Workers Union. The union advocated for the rights of migrant agricultural workers, and through strikes, boycotts, and cooperation with other civil rights groups like CORE and SNCC, as well as key political leaders like Robert Kennedy, was able to win substantial victories for the union, especially for grape workers. Consequently, Cass and I are big time grape guys. Huge grape guys. Massive grape guys. What's up, want grape? Too many grapes. Another important liberation movement that made considerable progress in the 1960s was the push for gay rights. Throughout American history, homosexuality was an unacknowledged reality in which homosexuals were effectively banned from most social and economic spheres. However, the Stonewall Riot of 1969 was in many ways the starting point for the gay rights movement, which has seen some of the most rapid gains of any liberation movement in American history. The Stonewall Inn was a gay bar located in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of New York City. Greenwich Village was a neighborhood that was a center of the gay community in New York City, and the Stonewall Inn was often the subject of raids and other assorted varieties of police harassment for years. Police in New York and elsewhere in the country would often raid bars frequented by homosexual patrons and assault, arrest, and humiliate patrons under the pretense that patrons were violating laws regarding public indecency. After years of this sort of harassment and humiliation, the patrons at Stonewall had had enough, and on June 27, 1969, gay onlookers of the raid began to taunt and attack the raiding police officers. A riot ensued, with a fire being started within the bar, almost trapping the policemen inside. The riot would inspire others to speak out and start organizations and organize marches and protests to advocate for gay rights. Conversations regarding one's sexuality would be pushed further to the mainstream, as sexuality sexuality was usually seen as something to be hidden before that. As a result of the gay liberation movement, homosexuality became a topic of increased acceptance in American society. In the 1950s, if one was lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, or belonging to any other non-heteronormative category, one essentially had to keep it hidden. Thanks to the gay rights movement, more and more LGBTQ+ members would express their sexuality publicly and unapologetically, and would challenge the belief that any sexual preference was more normal than another. Thanks to the continued efforts of gay rights activists, the liberation movement would win political offices and would gain greater acceptance in the mainstream. Perhaps most importantly, numerous lives would be saved as LGBTQ+ Americans would face fewer hostilities and therefore experience greater overall mental health. Despite setbacks like the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy of the United States military under the Clinton administration in the 90s, which established that gay members of the military had to hide their sexuality or face discharge, or George W. Bush's attempt to introduce a constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage in the early 2000s, the gay liberation movement achieved perhaps its greatest legal victory in the United States versus Windsor, when the Supreme Court ruled in 2013 that restricting the definition of marriage to only heterosexual couples was unconstitutional. In many states, though not all, same-sex marriage would be legalized with a great deal of celebration and fanfare. Which brings us to a discussion of the largest group of oppressed people in the United States and the world over, women. That's right, Taft loves the ladies, but hates guys. Hates guys a lot. In fact, he usually tries to bite them. Yep, Taft is a very militant feminist in a lot of ways. But we see in a lot of ways the women's liberation movement stalled in the 1920s after the passage of the 19th Amendment, but, like many movements of liberation, would reemerge and be reborn in the 1960s. Taft, you getting all graped up over there? The rebirth of the women's liberation movement in many ways began with the publication of The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan in 1963. The book examined the lives of women living the so-called ideal life for an American woman living in affluent suburbs as housewives. However, Friedan's work found that women had few outlets for any sort of creative or intellectual energies and found themselves frustrated and unhappy with the trappings created by American society for women. Out of these frustrations, greater efforts were placed by government to bring attention to gender discrimination. The Kennedy administration would pass the Equal Pay Act, which tried to ban the all-too-common action of paying women less than men despite doing the same job. Not too much long afterwards, Congress would incorporate Title VII into the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which extended provisions against racial discrimination to gender discrimination. Friedan and other leading feminists would create the National Organization for Women, or NOW, which would soon become the nation's largest and most influential feminist organization. The organization would take aim at the issues women faced in the workplace in terms of exclusion and unequal pay. They would also aim to create more spaces for women to engage socially, so they weren't simply relegated to living their lives solely as mothers and wives. But by the late 1960s, increasingly radical feminist demands were becoming more popular. Many women who worked with other New Left movements, whether it was the struggle for racial equality or the anti-war movement, became increasingly frustrated with the same male chauvinism present within many of these same movements that fought for social change. As a result, many younger feminists by the 1970s began to advocate for a full-blown assault on the male power structure within society, rather than simply a more meaningful and fulfilling space for women, as Betty Friedan had articulated. Here we see parallels between the African American civil rights movement and the feminist movement, as both movements became increasingly militant as progress was not moving quickly enough for large cross-sections of those within both liberation struggles. By the early 1970s, the women's movement had gained considerable momentum and had accomplished a great deal for women nationwide. Women would be included in government affirmative action programs, and the bulk of all male educational institutions would open their doors to women by the late 70s. Women would also make major achievements in the political and economic sectors of American society. The so-called two-career family, in which both wives and husbands were working full-time, was increasingly the norm, as nearly half of all married women held jobs by the 1970s. By 2010, women had become a part of nearly every office of government, as women were mayors, governors, members of the House, members of the Senate, and as recently as 2020, Vice President of the United States. However, the one conspicuous exception to women's political empowerment would, of course, be the office of the President. But despite the incredible achievement made by women, there were and are still numerous obstacles still to be overcome. Women still hold disproportionately fewer positions in leadership politically and economically compared to their percentage of the population. Also, the United States failed to ratify an Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, which would have ensured more legally supported notions of gender equality. Because of a great deal of pushback from supporters of the more traditional structure of female subordination to males, the ERA didn't pass, as many feared that it would destroy the traditional social fabric of American society. But one area in which feminists have fought for exhaustively is control over their own bodies and reproductive rights. In no other space of argument regarding feminism in the 20th century is any issue fought more intensely than the argument over abortion. Abortion had been legal in the United States up until the start of the 20th century, when it was banned. However, despite it being illegal, many women underwent abortions anyway, which were outside of the view of law enforcement and usually incredibly dangerous. However, with the strength of the new women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s, many states abandoned restrictions on abortion, and in 1973, the Supreme Court decided in the now famous Roe v. Wade case that laws prohibiting abortion in the first 3 months of a pregnancy were unconstitutional because they violated a woman's right to privacy. The decision remains perhaps the most controversial Supreme Court decision ever made. And just as feminism would emerge from its slumber in the 1960s and 70s, so did the environmentalist movement emerge from its slumber, as continuing concerns over the industrialization of the planet, as well as the growth of the study of ecology, as well as the greater appreciation of nature and its beauty within the counterculture movement, would all contribute to a growing sense of environmentalism in the United States. And there goes the grape. Nice work, Taft. For a long time, American environmentalists advocated for nature on mostly an aesthetic or almost spiritual sense. Their argument was essentially that the natural world was too beautiful and perhaps divine to spoil. And of course, as we examine the divine creation of this wild beast, who is currently obsessed with a grape, we may see some flaws in this argument. It's just a grape, Taft. But by the mid-20th century, more and more scientists and members of the American public began to become more focused on the study of the interconnectedness of the natural world, which is the study of ecology. Ecological studies like those presented in the 1880s by zoologist Stephen A. Forbes would prove over and over again that various natural processes related to one another and not isolated, meaning that if humans do something like, severely pollute the air in one place, it could have many disastrous impacts on nature in all other places, thus causing significant damage to our Earth's ability to sustain life as we know it. The study of ecology would find surging popularity in post-war America as the continued use of industrial practices alarmed ecologists and citizens alike. People were increasingly aware of the idea of food change and ecosystems, and were therefore much more fearful of a world in which humans continued to cause greater and greater amounts of damage. Perhaps the most powerful and enduring piece of work from this period would be the sensational 1962 book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. Carson would argue with a great degree of success that continued use of pesticides, especially DDT, would result in potentially catastrophic consequences for many life forms, including human beings. She painted a stark picture of a silent spring in which chemically infected birds would no longer sing, and the landscape would be marked with death, disease, and desolation. Silent Spring and other publications like it worked, as ecology would gain greater and greater support from Americans. Various forms of government, colleges, university foundation, Various forms of government, colleges, universities, foundations, and later even corporations would support and fund numerous ecological studies to help preserve and sustain all aspects of life on Earth. However, debates continue today as to whether or not we're really doing enough to save the environment or if we are still constructing our own ecological demise. Environmental advocates would also grow more sophisticated as the century progressed. Many of the old environmentalist organizations like the Sierra Club would stay intact, but many would partner up with other organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union or labor organizations like the AFL-CIO. The newer generation of environmentalists would rely on scientific research to provide clearer insight as to what was happening with nature, and they would also utilize legal teams to challenge policies and organizations that were harming the environment. They would also utilize grassroots organization to help fuel protest and public awareness. And lastly, they would also utilize political lobbying efforts to gain legislation to address some of these issues. Perhaps fittingly, the environmentalists sought to become as interconnected in their approach to change as nature itself. But nothing gave the environmentalist movement greater strength and momentum than the continued deterioration of the earth because of human pollution. As long as industrialized parts of the world experienced greater amounts of degradation because of pollution, greater amounts of people began to mobilize for a cleaner, more sustainable earth. Whether it was suffocating smog in Los Angeles, acid rain in Europe, the destruction of the rainforest in Brazil, or the Cuyahoga River lighting on fire because of the continued dumping of petrochemicals, people began to realize that saving the planet was a movement that had to be taken more seriously and urgently. One of the first major efforts of the environmentalist movement was the first Earth Day. For a long time, environmentalism had been associated with other far-left movements like civil rights and anti-war protests, which scared a lot of Americans. Earth Day was a movement aimed to stand separate from those movements with a less militant approach. To a large degree, it worked, as nearly 20 million Americans participated in Earth Day observances in April of 1970. Out of this movement, a more inclusive movement emerged with a great degree less divisiveness that one saw in civil rights and anti-war movements. It would also see a degree of success in terms of policy, as the Environmental Protection Agency would be signed by President Nixon. The EPA would enact standards and regulations on helping keeping the air and water clean, along with other environmental protection standards. Though it has not stopped all pollution, it is constantly under threat from those wishing to see less government regulation, and maybe too little too late in terms of halting climate change, the EPA and acts associated with it did mark at least some progress towards achieving a greater degree of public concern for the environment. And if you're thinking the only thing Richard Nixon did was create the EPA, you are dead wrong, mister. He did other stuff too. Nixon would win the 1968 presidential election under the premise that he would control law and order at home and abroad. However, during his presidency, he would find himself just as entangled in the mess of Vietnam as well as other third world country entanglements as much as his predecessors. Are you done with the grape now? You pretending you're done with the grape? You're not done with the grape. Though Nixon was passionate about international affairs, he would appoint a man to the office of National Security Advisor who would come to dominate the administration in terms of foreign diplomacy in Henry Kissinger. Kissinger was a Harvard professor who was able to use his intellect, his bureaucratic skill, and his ability to handle the press to become the most important and influential figure in the president's cabinet regarding foreign policy. Together, Kissinger and Nixon would seek to somehow end the brutal stalemate in Vietnam. The new Vietnam policy sought to stem dissent at home and to train the South Vietnamese to fight this war effectively on their own without American support. To stem opposition to the war at home, Nixon would decrease the Army's reliance on the draft, as the drafting of young Americans into the war was a very easy target for protesters. Instead, Nixon would use a lottery system which would limit conscription to 19-year-olds who had low lottery numbers. Nixon would later urge the formation of an all-volunteer army, and by 1973, the draft system known as the Selective Service System was on its way out. More importantly, the policy of Vietnamization, which essentially meant the process of training and equipping the South Vietnamese military to take over the war effort for themselves, was underway. Nixon would steadily decrease the amount of American ground troops in Vietnam, as the total amount of troops would reduce from about 540,000 in 1969 to 60,000 by 1972. Though the decreased use of the draft and American soldiers did limit opposition to the war at home, it did nothing to increase America's leverage in negotiating with the North Vietnamese. As a result, new military pressures would be needed. To do further damage to the North Vietnamese without dramatically escalating troop presence, Nixon and Kissinger aimed to target military bases in the neighboring country of Cambodia. The United States military believed that it was at these bases that North Vietnamese troops were mounting their attacks. Nixon would arrange for secret attacks and would arrange for the Cambodian government to be overthrown by a military dictator named General Lon Nol. Nixon would then order American troops to invade Cambodian bases to clean out any remaining areas of enemy military aggression. The invasion of Cambodia would rekindle the anti-war movement with remarkable intensity. The movement would become all the more intense after 4 students were shot and killed by National Guardsmen at Kent State in May of 1970. 10 days later, police would kill 2 demonstrating black students at Jackson State University. The anti-war movement would be further strengthened by the release of a report of the dealings of the Defense Department during the Johnson administration. The report, known as the Pentagon Papers, essentially confirmed what anti-war protesters had known all along, that the government had not been honest in its dealings with the American public and what was really happening in Vietnam. Needless to say, discipline and morale among American troops in Vietnam was at an all-time low. Americans would witness this sort of come to a head with the My Lai massacre, in which Lieutenant William Calley was charged with overseeing the slaughter of over 300 unarmed South Vietnamese. This atrocity and many others that Americans believed had also occurred would be one of the causes of over 2/3 of Americans believing that the United States must end its involvement in Vietnam. However, the 1972 North Vietnamese attack, known as the Easter Offensive, would provide yet more evidence that without American support, South Vietnam would fall to their northern counterparts. The attack was ultimately repelled, but all who were present knew that without American support, South Vietnam would have surely fallen to the north. With the 1972 presidential election looming, Nixon had hoped desperately to find some sort of breakthrough in negotiations with the North Vietnamese. Henry Kissinger would indicate that peace was at hand, but the South Vietnamese would refuse the peace terms Kissinger had made with North Vietnamese Foreign Press Secretary Le Duc Do in Paris. As a result, hostilities would resume as the United States would initiate a series of air raids known as the Christmas bombings, as the largest and most destructive bombing raids as the whole war would be conducted on North Vietnamese cities. As the death toll of mostly civilians mounted, Nixon ended the bombing, and shortly thereafter, the North Vietnamese returned to the negotiating table. With a greater deal of pressure from the United States, the South would agree to essentially the same deal reached earlier by Kissinger and the North Vietnamese. American prisoners of war would be released by the North Vietnamese. The Southern regime under the leadership of Nguyen Van Thieu would remain intact, but Northern Vietnamese soldiers would still be allowed to occupy South Vietnam. With a peace treaty in hand, the United States occupation would soon end, but almost as soon as significant American forces left Vietnam, the communists immediately took the offensive. Northern Vietnamese soldiers would invade the South, taking the South and its capital, Saigon. As Saigon fell, the disgraced government of Nguyen Van Thieu would flee via helicopter, along with the few Americans that were still left. The American president at the time, Gerald Ford, who was not eaten by wolves, asked Congress for help, and they refused. Saigon would be renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and the nation of Vietnam would begin the process of reunification under the leadership of the government in Hanoi. Neighboring Cambodia would also fall to communists, as the murderous government of the brutal dictator Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge would begin a genocidal campaign that cost the lives of 1/3 of all Cambodians. After spending $150 billion, losing the lives of 55 75,000 American soldiers, losing the lives of 1.2 million Vietnamese soldiers, and spending nearly 10 years engaged in a war to keep Vietnam from being communist, Vietnam became communist anyways in 1975. The country has remained a communist country closely aligned with communist China ever since. Now, one might think with the debacle and constant hum of Vietnam going on within the background or at the forefront of the American consciousness, Nixon may have not really wanted to focus on any other sort of foreign entanglement, but he would actually get involved with lots of other world affairs, as his desire to dismantle the bipolar notion of the world as being only controlled by the United States or the Soviet Union was very much on his agenda. He would instead try to establish a multipolar world in which the competing interests of the United States, Western Europe, China, Japan, and of course the Soviet Union would hopefully balance out world affairs and prevent a future catastrophe. As you may remember, World War II was an interruption of the eventual communist takeover of China. The nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek would be expelled to Taiwan, and America would refuse to recognize or even acknowledge mainland China, the second largest country on earth at the time. Well, that all began to change under the Nixon administration, as he would first arrange for a secret meeting between Kissinger and Chinese officials in the Chinese capital of Beijing. Shortly thereafter, much to the surprise of the world, Nixon announced he would travel to China himself. Nixon would help convince the United Nations to admit China as a member and would promptly expel the Taiwanese diplomats from the UN altogether. Because of his visit, Nixon helped ease American hostility towards the Chinese and helped to broker a nuclear disarmament deal with the Soviet Union. Under the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT I, both the United States and the Soviet Union would agree to freeze construction of any new nuclear missiles. And Nixon wouldn't stop at involving himself in China and Vietnam. He would also involve himself in numerous other regions as he sought to demonstrate his commitment to multipolarity. However, this often posed problems, as the United States' involvement in assorted international affairs would prove to be quite complicated, expensive, and volatile. Nixon was especially worried about the Third World, which is, as I've mentioned before, mostly the non-industrialized, recently decolonized areas of the world that were neither aligned with capitalist America or communist Russia. Nixon predicted that the Third World would be the largest source of instability, as he would outline his Nixon Doctrine, which stated the United States would, quote-unquote, participate in the defense and development of allies and friends, but would leave the future of those friends to themselves. And if that seems confusing and contradictory, it's because it is. You can't really develop and defend a country without influencing its future. And because of this policy, the United States from the Nixon administration onwards would find itself increasingly involved in the foreign affairs of other countries, as it would hypocritically and imperialistically make itself look quite the fool more than once. Big yikes, Taft. One area where we see American involvement become as complicated as it was volatile was in Israel. In 1967, Israel, with a great deal of support and aid from Western Europe and the United States, routed the Arab governments of Jordan, Syria, and Egypt in yet another outbreak of hostilities between the predominantly Arab countries of the region against their newest Jewish neighbor. As a result, Israel gained a great deal of land, including the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. And they would call this the Six-Day War because it lasted... No, Taft, it lasted 6 days. 6-Day War. 7 Years' War was way earlier. Indeed it was, Taft. Indeed it was. 6 years later, Israel would be attacked yet again by Arab countries on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur. And again, Israeli forces, with a great deal of aid from the United States, pushed the Arab countries back and looked poised to launch a counteroffensive until the United States pressured the Israelis to cease fire. But oil-rich countries near the Persian Gulf decided to strike back at Israel's allies by refusing to sell oil to them in 1973 during the oil embargo. The resulting oil crisis served as a reminder to the United States as to how dependent it had become on Arab oil and how complex geopolitics can be. And we'll also take a look at the politics and economics of Richard Nixon as he first aimed to undo a lot of the Great Society initiatives as he tried to balance the desires of the middle class with the needs of the working and lower classes. He would also try to balance the power of the federal government with the interests of state and local governments. However, as we shall see, most of his political and economic efforts were ultimately undone by a series of crises, which were in a lot of ways his own doing. In terms of his domestic policy, Nixon got to work right away trying to undo the Great Society. He would claim to represent the, quote, silent majority, unquote, of Americans who he claimed were tired of the federal government interfering with the lives of ordinary Americans. And according to Nixon, ordinary Americans didn't want the government to integrate schools, as he would try to ban the practice of busing, which was an effort to force segregated communities to integrate their schools by busing kids from certain communities to another. He would also end the practice of withholding federal money to schools who refused to integrate, and he would abolish the Office of Economic Opportunity, which was the centerpiece of the anti-poverty movement of the Great Society. Now, Nixon did try to introduce the Family Assistance Plan, which would have been an incredibly bold anti-poverty move in that it would have basically given a guaranteed income of $1,600 for American families, which could be supplemented by outside incomes up to $4,000. But that idea got destroyed on all fronts, as conservatives didn't like the idea of a guaranteed income, and welfare recipients didn't like it as they felt that the basic income, which was about the same as $11,000 today, was not enough. One of the main enemies of conservatives like Nixon was the Supreme Court. The court, under the direction of Chief Justice Earl Warren, would pass numerous decisions that would uphold civil liberties, much to the chagrin of many conservatives. Nixon would then try to pack the court with conservatives, but found his efforts fruitless as his more conservative picks like Harold Carswell or Clement Haynsworth would both be flatly rejected by the Senate. As a result, Nixon was forced to appoint justices who were more moderate and would to a large degree affirm many of the Warren Court positions regarding civil liberties. In Baker v. Carr, the court would rule that state legislatures had to apportion voting districts so that all citizens had equal say in voting rather than disproportionately giving weight to rural districts. Oh, United States Senate, cough, cough, because they give so much disproportionate power to rural areas as opposed to more populated areas. Cough, excuse me. You're right, Taft. I'm a real Paul Coffey over here. The court would also rule famously in favor of women's right to an abortion in Roe v. Wade, and would rule in favor of affirmative action programs in Bakke versus the Board of Regents of California, though it would place restrictions on how affirmative action would work. Again, affirmative action is the process of granting educational and employment opportunities to African Americans and other historically marginalized groups. But of course, in 1972, there was a presidential election, and going into the 1972 presidential election, Nixon had a considerable amount of momentum and good fortune. He also had a good deal of good fortune because he was illegally spying on the Democratic campaign, but we'll get to that later. With his de-escalation of the war in Vietnam, his massive amounts of campaign donations, as well as his highly publicized visits to foreign countries and internal policy decisions, Nixon was in a great position to win and win easily. However, he was worried about the unapologetic racist Governor George Wallace running again and eating into the Southern racist vote that Republican political strategists had been working to build into their coalition ever since this voting bloc became alienated with the Democratic agenda of social justice and civil rights during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. However, George Wallace would drop out of the campaign after he was shot by an assassin and paralyzed from the waist down. What further aided Nixon's campaign was the Democratic nomination of South Dakota Governor George McGovern. McGovern represented one of the most liberal wings of the Democratic Party, and Republicans were able to paint him as a candidate who wanted to use the government to intrude on people's lives and sow the seeds of more social turmoil. Nixon won re-election by one of the largest margins of victory in history, 60.7% of the popular vote to McGovern's 37.5%, while also receiving 520 electoral votes to McGovern's dismal and frankly pathetic 7. But Nixon would oversee an increasingly troubling economic trend that had been in process for decades leading up to the 1970s. Since the end of World War II, the United States enjoyed a great deal of economic privilege in that it had very little foreign competition in terms of providing manufactured goods and also had easy and cheap access to raw materials from third world countries. The robust economy of the 1950s and 60s gave Americans a false sense that prosperity was permanent. Well, it wasn't, and we first see this with inflation. And remember, inflation is when basically you have too much money in an economy chasing too few goods, which causes that same money to become less and less valuable. It's kind of how a cheeseburger goes from costing 10 cents in the 1950s to nearly $3 now. Same cheeseburger, 28 times more expensive. Taft, the early 2000s called, and they want their meme back. Well, the government added a ton of money into the American economy with the incredibly expensive programs of the Great Society and the Vietnam War. Adding to that, many of the raw materials from the Third World suddenly became massively expensive as these countries realized their worth and began doing something about it. The clearest example of this would be the oil industry, and the oil-rich nations of the Persian Gulf would create the Organizations of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. As these were also Arab countries, they would also become more militant in response to American policies in the region, especially as they pertain to the support of Israel. In response to the Yom Kippur War of 1973, OPEC nations would ban the export of oil to America and its allies. They would also raise oil prices by 400%, thus causing the first oil crisis in the United States since World War II. With the massive increase in the price of oil and the fact that oil and gasoline are used to move everything in this country, the price of everything increased dramatically in the early 1970s. And lastly, American industry would begin its long and painful descent in the 1970s. American factories had never really modernized since World War II, and foreign competitors in Asia and Europe were able to produce goods that were cheaper to make and increasingly of higher quality. As many American workers were unionized, the price of labor was much more expensive in the United States than elsewhere, which would allow foreign companies who were able to easily exploit labor to sell for lower prices. American factories would close in rapid succession throughout the 1970s and 80s as formerly robust towns dependent on industry now became rusted-out husks of their former selves. America's factory workers found themselves unemployed or underemployed as the United States would deindustrialize and pivot to a country dependent on technology, information systems, finance, and other, quote, knowledge-based, unquote, industries. In many ways, the country is still struggling to manage this type of economy, as it would appear that the means of distributing wealth throughout the population is far less even than the manufacturing economy that preceded it. From about World War II up to the 1970s, most Americans saw about the same percentage of increased wealth regardless of their level of income. Whether you were among the 20% richest Americans or the 20% poorest Americans, your income went up about the same rate. But starting in 1973, that began to change and hasn't really changed since. When one examines the top earners of the American economy, we see that the richest 20% of Americans increased their wealth at a much higher rate than the earners below them. And we see wealth increase even more for the richest 10% and a ton more for the richest 1%. Meanwhile, the poorest 20% of the nation has seen their incomes decrease during these years, and the middle has seen their wealth remain flat. Today, we see some of the most unprecedented levels of wealth inequality in our nation's history. And some rich people will make the argument that the ongoing trend of the wealth of the nation being concentrated in a few very wealthy hands is a good thing, that if they have that money, they can create jobs, and that money will eventually trickle down to the rest of us. Well, I can tell you, as a person who earns a lower middle income, who works in a town that is predominantly working class, right next to some towns that are some of the wealthiest places in the world, the whole idea of wealth trickling down has not been a thing that I have seen in my experience. You sure did, Daft. Trickled your little heart out. Most trickling we've seen here in a while. To try and deal with these massive economic issues of inflation and inequality, Nixon opted to try and control inflation. He and the predominantly conservative economists in charge of the Federal Reserve would increase interest rates and contracted the money supply. With less money and fewer people willing to spend said money, the nation's economy would struggle to create jobs and grow its economy. It became stagnant. But inflation would still increase despite Nixon's attempt to freeze prices and wages. So with a stagnant economy and rising inflation, we had the unique economic calamity of stagflation. No new jobs, but everything is becoming more expensive, which stinks. Stinks real bad. Stinks worse than Taft's breath. Oh no, it stinks. And of course, the conversation of Richard Nixon always has to end with the Watergate crisis. And let me make this clear, Watergate does not bother me. Yes, sometimes. But we will see that the Watergate scandal would be the undoing of the Nixon administration, and it would also be a major cause in the perhaps permanent distrust of the American public in its own government. Nixon and other presidents before him had been executing many somewhat illegal actions as the growing public expectations conflicted with the constitutional constrictions faced by the president. Nixon and his almost dictatorially led administration greatly increased this trend of getting what they wanted via illegal means, and this is eventually what would disgrace him forever. In the wee hours of June 17, 1972, police arrested 5 men who had broken into the offices of the Democratic National Committee inside the Watergate office building. They were essentially trying to find the key aspects of the Democrats' election campaign strategy for the 1972 election. However, in the ensuing investigation, it was found that these burglars were actually paid to do this by the Nixon campaign. Public interest in the story would verge on obsession as various White House and election officials would be investigated and would divulge information on a nefarious and illegal plot that seemed to start at President Nixon himself. Out of this investigation, 2 separate scandals would emerge. One was the string of illegal activities coordinated by the Nixon administration, and there was almost no evidence linked to Nixon regarding those activities. However, there was also the matter of the cover-up of these illegal activities, and there was a significant amount of evidence the president was connected to the cover-up. The prevailing question throughout the Watergate investigation would come from Senator Howard Baker when he asked, quote, "What did the president know, and when did he know it?" unquote. It turns out the president knew quite a bit. Nixon would watch as more and more members of his administration would be forced to resign for their role in the scandals. He would maintain that he was innocent and that any wrongdoing done within his administration was done independently without his consent. And he might have gotten away with this, except the audio of all his conversations regarding the cover-up had been recorded. So dumb. Nixon would try and block the release of the tapes of these conversations, citing executive privilege, which is basically the protection presidents get to have to keep certain things private in the interest of national security. However, Nixon's own appointed prosecutor, Archibald Cox, would take Nixon to court in order to force him to release his recordings. So Nixon would exercise his right as president to fire the person he hired to prosecute himself. So dumb. But with the firing of Cox came the so-called Saturday Night Massacre, when other members of the Nixon-appointed Justice Department would also resign in protest, including Attorney General Elliot Richardson. Nixon would have to appoint a new special prosecutor to prosecute himself. So dumb. Nixon's impending fall from grace would further escalate with the ruin of Vice President Spiro Agnew. Agnew was found guilty of accepting bribes and kickbacks when he was previously governor of Maryland and also while he was vice president. The controversial Agnew would resign from his post, and Gerald Ford, the affable congressman from Michigan, would be appointed according to the provisions of the 25th Amendment. The case to get Nixon to release the White House tapes eventually reached the Supreme Court, who decided in July of 1974 in the case the United States versus Richard M. Nixon that he had to release the tapes. Nixon first tried to release an edited version of the tapes, but even those made him look guilty. So dumb. The final straw in proving Nixon's guilt was that the tapes revealed that Nixon himself tried to cover up Watergate as he ordered the FBI to end the Watergate investigation just days after the initial break-in. His removal from office was all but inevitable, but Nixon was a slippery rascal who managed to resign before being impeached and forced from office. Relieved and exhilarated Americans watched Nixon leave the White House for the last time and hear newly sworn-in President Gerald Ford proclaim, "Our long national nightmare is over." But though Americans were relieved that Nixon was gone, their faith in the American government may have been destroyed forever. Next, we shall take a look at life after the 1960s and 70s as we look at the conservative revival of Ronald Reagan, as well as the impact of the band Def Leppard on the 1980s. I'm just kidding, Taft. We're not actually going to really talk about Def Leppard, but it would be really cool if we did, am I right? Indeed, it would be. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. On behalf of William Howard Taft and myself, we thank all of you. And don't forget, we got to keep pushing, G. We did it, Taft. We did it. To reward you, here is a nice grape. Are you done with the grape? You don't care about the grape anymore? You care about the grape. You'll always care about the grape.